Hey, welcome back or welcome to our weekly Bible study. My name is James, and we are going through the Gospel of Mark and looking at the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. The part of his life that we're to is that last week before the cross, and he's in Jerusalem and he's getting assailed by all these questions, and some of them are absolutely genuine and real questions, as we'll see in next week's study, and some of them are like the one we're looking at today. Absolutely, you know from the first time that you hear it, it's a trap. And Jesus catches on to that. Son of God, knows their hearts, knows their motives, catches on pretty quick. But this one is so blaringly obvious in its insincerity and, well, you've had these questions asked you, right? Somebody comes up, they flatter you a little bit, and then they ask you a question that you can smell it in the air. This is not what it appears to be. This is a trap. And you get annoyed, right? And sometimes you get a little sarcastic and biting in your answers. Well, Jesus does this time too. His answer to their question is quite strong. And, let's just dive into Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 18, and hear him in his own words. Then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow but also died, leaving no child. It was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her?" Jesus replied, "Are you not in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now about the dead rising, have you not read the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, 'I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob'? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken." See, I told you that Jesus was blunt in his response to their question. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with me? And you might be surprised how many ways Jesus' response is all about you. And we'll get to that. But before we can, we really have to look at who's asking the question. So we know that it is the Sadducees. And who were the Sadducees? This was a particular sect among the Jewish leadership, and they were people that were actually quite conservative. And conservative not in the American Western sense, conservative in the sense that when they looked at what they believed, they only looked at, of course, the Old Testament. That's all there was among those scriptures at the time. But they even narrowed that down further. They wouldn't go Genesis to Malachi like you and I would. They would go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, the Big Five. And that was all that they saw as legitimate scripture. Other books like Isaiah or Daniel or anything else was treated pretty suspect and certainly not treated as authoritative scripture. So they were quite conservative from that point of view. Now, the problem with that might not even seem immediately obvious, but it means that there were things like the resurrection that they didn't believe were talked about in the Pentateuch, and we'll get to how wrong that belief was in a second. But because they didn't see just an explicit mention of it in the scriptures that they were reading, they thought that the idea of resurrection was illegitimate. And because of that, they were always at odds with Jesus, obviously, who taught the resurrection of the dead, but also with the Pharisees. And so you often see the Sadducees and the Pharisees arguing whenever the subject of resurrection comes up. Paul in the book of Acts uses that to his advantage, gets them to start an argument while he ducks out and avoids more persecution than he had already endured. Pretty smart, that of Paul. But it put them at odds with the Pharisees in this regard. And that actually plays, I think, into the conversation and the trap question of Jesus a little bit, even though the Pharisees are never mentioned or brought up in context. But that also helps us understand the insincerity of the question. Why would you ask a question about how things are going to go down in the resurrection when you don't even think it's real? So they're setting Jesus up for a trap. One, he has to, in order to answer the question, he's got to be admitting that he believes in the resurrection of the dead, which in their minds automatically makes him a false teacher. So from their point of view, there is no good answer. There's no right answer unless he comes out and says, well, there is no resurrection of the dead. That's the trap that they think that they have put him in. I do think that they are actually trying to get two birds with one stone. They want to discredit Jesus, obviously, but if they're able to discredit Jesus over the resurrection, they probably feel like they're discrediting the Pharisees as well, and then they can gain more influence. They're jealous because the Pharisees, frankly, even though they're not popular in the way we talk about them today, the Pharisees were very popular among the Jews at the time. And that's because the Pharisees were, believe it or not, the more open-minded of the two groups. I know that kind of seems crazy looking back, 2020 hindsight and all, but the Pharisees were the more open-minded, and so they believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in some of the things that Jesus taught, even though they didn't believe in Jesus for the most part. There were believing Pharisees, don't forget, but it makes for an interesting dynamic as they ask the question. But interesting is not the way that Jesus takes the question. So let's look again at the question. They ask, there are these 7 brothers, and you have the responsibility in Jewish culture at the time, if there are no children, to take a man's widow and to carry on the family name. I know that sounds crazy, and I'm sure there are people watching this video going, oh, wow, am I glad we don't have that, both from the brother and the wife's perspective, right? But that's the way it was. And so they ask this question. If the husband dies and she marries and marries and marries and never has children, and then eventually she dies as well, probably out of great relief, frankly, whose wife will she be at the resurrection? I think they not only think they have the perfect trap, I think they're doing what sometimes people now do, and that is demonstrating what you believe to be absurdity by being absurd. And they certainly have asked an absurd question, and I think it's because they're trying to illustrate that they think the resurrection and all of this stuff is just hokey and silly, and why are we even putting up with this? And I think that may be why Jesus is as blunt as he was. I think Jesus is deeply insulted by the fact that they are treating the resurrection and the promise of God and the hope of the Jewish people then, Christians today, with such disdain. And he answers the question so sharply. He says, isn't it because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God that you get this so wrong? And that could not have landed well. And he didn't intend for it to land well, frankly. He's really not worried about offending these Sadducees in this particular thing. He wants to wake them up and to open their eyes and to help them see. And so he answers so bluntly. How would you take it if somebody said to you, isn't it because you don't know anything about the scripture? Well, if you're a Christian, or as they were, if you're a Jew, you would be insulted. You would be offended. And yet this is what Jesus says. And they probably felt about the same that you and I would if somebody said that. And how would you feel if somebody says to you, do you even know the power of God? Is that why you get this so wrong? It is a rough answer. And I think Jesus is also trying to teach us a bonus lesson here, and that is, don't mock what you don't understand. We can be really bad about just having a knee-jerk, skeptical, cynical even mindset to a belief that is different from what we've generally understood. And sometimes we reject outright with mockery what is actually true according to the scriptures. And so we need to be careful about that. That's what they were doing, and I think we're actually supposed to catch on to that and learn to do better. So then Jesus doesn't get into the whole lineage and, what do you do about this woman? Instead, he says to them, is it because you don't understand the scriptures? Is it because you don't understand the power of God? It's not even going to be like that, is what he basically says next. Because at the resurrection, you will become like the angels. Now, let me clarify some things, because we have popular beliefs from culture that don't actually come from Scripture. And sometimes we hold on to those cultural popular beliefs that we learned from, Plato and Bugs Bunny, frankly. More strongly than we hold on to the Scriptures. He doesn't say we become angels. Scripture never says that. Humans, angels, two completely different created beings. One does not become the other in either direction. And that's not what he's saying. He says you will become like them. Well, like them how? You will live in the presence of God. We know this from what scriptures have taught forever, right? Genesis to Revelation, we know this is what it's going to be. We will live in the presence of God. Garden Eden type fellowship again. So you will live in the presence of God. You will be eternal. 1 Corinthians 15 goes into this, that we will rise never to perish or die again. Okay? So we will be eternal. You see, the angels, faithful to God, are not part of the fall and do not suffer death as we do, and we will once again be like that. We will have a spiritual body, and we will have a body that will be spiritual. Now, that doesn't mean disembodied spirits. Again, that's Plato and Bugs Bunny, not Scripture. It will be, as my teacher Ed Wharton likes to say, it will be a spiritual body. It can't be a spiritual body without a body. So what does that mean? We don't fully know. And that brings us to some other scripture, right? 1 John chapter 3, verse 2 says that we do not know yet what we will be. We only know that we will be like him, Jesus, talking about the resurrected Jesus. So at the resurrection, we will be like the resurrected Christ. What does that mean fully? We don't know. And I always say, if the Apostle John doesn't know, Preacher James doesn't know. And I don't worry about it. So I don't know all the details. I don't know exactly what that body will be like. That's okay. Doesn't matter. I trust that it's going to be awesome, because that's what everything in Scripture points to, is an face-to-face fellowship with God, completely renewed, never again to deal with death or disease, like the angels who don't deal with death or disease. And I'm all for that, whether I know what that means or not, right? But the people he's talking to don't even believe in any of that. When you die, you're just like Rover, dead all over. So Jesus reminds them, listen, there is a resurrection. It is real. And there is hope in that resurrection. And there is renewal in that resurrection. And there is restoration in that resurrection. You will be like the angels. You will be eternal again. You will be disease-free again, death-free again, in the presence of God face to face, to walk in the cool of the evening like in the Garden of Eden again. And he says, don't you remember that when Moses spoke to God there in the burning bush, that God identified himself? Remember, Moses said, who shall I say sent me? And he says, you tell them I am has sent you. And who is the I am? He says he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He quotes the Pentateuch, the Big Five, the only books that these men who are mocking him believe are Scripture, and who say nowhere in the Pentateuch is the resurrection mentioned. Nowhere is there anything about life after death. And he says, really? Moses was told that God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And God isn't the God of dead people. God is the God of the living. And that means Abraham lives. Isaac lives. Jacob lives. He says if he is the God of those men, then they must be alive. And if they are alive, then there is life after what you see as death. And if they are alive, then let me tell you something. All these people around here, they will live again too. And it must have come across to them like a thunderclap. The earth must have shook inside their minds as they understood their trap had just completely blown up in their face, because it well and truly had. And yet that's not even the main reason Jesus says it. He's trying to open their eyes and the eyes of the people around them to this. There is life again. There is hope again when you believe in Jesus. There is life again, and there is hope again when you believe God's promises of a resurrection. It will be real. We may not understand everything about it. That's not even important. It will be. So he looks at those Sadducees in the eyes and says, you guys, you've gotten it very wrong. That answer so impressed people around him that a man walks up to him and says, well then, Lord, I've got another question. And that man was a teacher of the law. And that teacher of the law came to him because he was impressed that Jesus had answered so well. And that's going to be our text next week. And we're going to look at his question, which is not a trap. It is genuine and it is sincere, and what Jesus has to say about it. But it was because of his answer about the resurrection that the man asked. So, let me ask you this. What do you think about Jesus' answer? Do you trust his hope for your future? Because that answer was all about you. Do you have a faith and a hope that you will rise again? If you have questions, please contact us. We'll be glad to study with you and answer whatever we can, point you to the scriptures. We're going to point you to Jesus. That's always going to be our goal. And then join us again next week as we continue our journey through the life of Jesus Christ and his word for you. Rise up, O men of God.